Linda Maria Ronstadt was born on July 15th, 1946, in Tucson, Arizona, into a family where it was almost impossible not to become a musician. Her father, Gilbert, a descendant of Mexican settlers, ran a business selling furniture and ranch equipment. But more importantly, in the evenings, he would pick up his guitar and sing serenades in Spanish, immersing his children in the world of rancheras and Mexican ballads. Her mother, Ruth Mary Koopman, of German and Dutch descent, instilled in her 4 children a love of classical music. Although the Ronstadt and Koopman families were better known for inventors and businessmen in their lineage, Linda and her siblings were determined to be musicians. They spent half the day huddled around the radio listening to the latest rock and roll from Elvis, the blues of Ray Charles, and the country sound of Hank Williams. The other half of the day they spent trying to sing what they'd just heard, accompanying one another on various instruments. As they grew older, those childhood games turned into a serious passion. By the age of 14, Linda had formed a folk trio with her brother Peter and sister Gretchen. They performed in coffee houses, student dorms, and other small venues under names like Union City Ramblers and the Three Ronstadts, even making studio recordings in Tucson as the New Union Ramblers. It was already clear that Linda stood out in the family trio with a much wider vocal range. Bob Kimmel, then considered a rising folk star in Tucson, noticed it too. After seeing the trio perform in the late 1950s, he recognized in Linda a true artist and even invited her to join him in Los Angeles in search of fame. But at the time, young Linda didn't yet see herself as a performer. More importantly, she didn't want to disappoint her parents. She thought it made far more sense to finish school and university before even considering a creative career. But the arrival of the 1960s changed everything. A folk revolution was sweeping the country, and the California scene was just beginning to take shape. Enrolling at the University of Arizona to study theater, Linda soon realized that lectures and exams were only holding her back. And so, after her first semester in 1964, the 18-year-old made the bold decision to move to Los Angeles and reunite with her old friend Bob Kimmel. Her fellow Tucson native didn't yet have a glittering career, but Bob Kimmel already had a few connections. More importantly, he was busy writing folk songs with guitarist Kenny Edwards. When Ronstadt joined their duo, the three of them formed the Stone Ponies, Linda's first real platform as an artist. Thanks to Kimmel's contacts, the trio managed to sign a contract with Capitol Records, and in just 15 months, the Stone Ponies released 3 albums. Their debut, the Stone Ponies, was fairly unremarkable, sounding much like any other folk ensemble of the time. From the very first notes, you could hear how hard the trio was trying, but failing, to reach the level of Peter, Paul, and Mary. It was on their second record, Evergreen, Volume 2, that Kimmel put Linda's vocals front and center, and suddenly the group began to attract real attention. The standout was Different Drum, a song written by Mike Nesmith, soon to be a member of the Monkees. Linda's performance turned it into a hit, climbing high on the charts. It was a rare moment in folk rock. Instead of simply blending in, the female voice completely took over the song. That was when Ronstadt first caught the ear of music critics, many of whom saw her as the driving force of the group. Most importantly, the success of Different Drum had a big impact on Capitol's producers. They no longer viewed the Stone Ponies as a balanced folk trio. They now believed the group should evolve into a solo project for Ronstadt. You can feel that shift on the third album, Stone Ponies and Friends Volume 3, where the folk ensemble was almost entirely overshadowed by Linda's voice. For Bob Kimmel, it was a hard realization. From the start, he knew Linda Ronstadt had incredible potential, but he never imagined he would end up being just a stepping stone to her larger stage. In 1969, Linda Ronstadt stepped out of the shadow of being the girl from a folk trio and deliberately began building her solo career. Carefully analyzing her strengths, she chose the role of an interpreter, with an unfailing instinct for choosing the right songs and a steel-edged delivery that turned other people's material into her own. Her first solo album, Hand-Sewn, Homegrown, sounded like a manifesto of early country rock. Clean arrangements, a blend of tradition and electric edge, and a few bold covers. Commercially, the record was modest, but in essence it was important. It marked the arrival of a singer who no longer hid in the chorus, but placed her voice front and center, laying out the blueprint for her future repertoire, spanning country standards to the new wave of singer-songwriters. The real turning point came with Silk Purse, released in 1970 and recorded in Nashville. Ronstadt dove deeper into country, testing herself against a room full of session sharks, and came out with her first big solo hit, Long, Long Time. That song was a perfect example of her method. Not vocal acrobatics, but nerve and breath control, where every phrase drags just slightly behind the beat, cutting even deeper because of it. Behind the scenes, things were far less stable. Commercial breakthrough still eluded her, and Ronstadt had to cover expenses with grueling tours that drained her physically. She also faced constant clashes with producers, who demanded a fixed formula for success that could guarantee profits. In just a few years, the fragile girl from Tucson had to become a practical manager, someone who not only defended her artistic principles but proved they were worth something. Ronstadt also had a gift for the right connections. In the early 70s, she grew close to the circle of Jackson Browne, Neil Young, and J.D. Souther, who would later become her long-term partner. These were songwriters she instinctively understood, and their material would soon become central to her identity as an interpreter. Continuing her journey, Ronstadt released her self-titled album, Linda Ronstadt, in 1972. It was a bridge to the so-called Los Angeles school. More emphasis on the songwriter, less on pure country, and subtler dynamics. Commercially, however, it was another flop, and Capitol grew disillusioned with her. Still, it's important to see her as a catalyst of the 70s scene because it was on that record and its tour that her backing band began to crystallize, the group that would later become the Eagles. At the same time, Ronstadt knew that without commercial success, her own future was in jeopardy. This is where her instinct for connections came into play once again. She crossed paths with Peter Asher, a man with impeccable taste in material and producer-level discipline. Asher became her manager and the architect of her sound. For the first time, her repertoire began to be shaped into cohesive albums rather than just collections of good songs. The first positive result was Don't Cry Now, released in 1973 on Asylum Records. Listeners and critics immediately noticed how much more mature the record sounded with a sharper sense of drama. The ballad Love Has No Pride cemented her as a singer capable of delivering catharsis without melodrama, while her cover of Desperado underscored her gift for taking a man's lyric and making it her own without losing the truth of the text. The true Asher era began in 1974 with the release of Heart Like a Wheel. Early in 1975, You're No Good hit #1 in the US, When Will I Be Loved climbed to #2 on the pop charts and topped the country chart, and the album itself reached #1 on the Billboard 200. On stage, a signature image was taking shape: jeans, boots, and an almost austere presence. No glitter, no gimmicks, just the band, the song, and the voice. Behind the scenes, it meant a punishing schedule, endless flights, the first big money, and equally big responsibility. Linda Ronstadt was now officially the front figure of a genre, the bridge between country and pop rock. After the breakthrough of Don't Cry Now, Linda's momentum was unstoppable. She wasn't just consolidating her success, she was climbing peak after peak. It started with Prisoner in Disguise in 1975, which cemented her method. Other people's songs treated like raw plays, restaged by Ronstadt to change their conflict and their temperature. From Neil Young's Love is a Rose to Smokey Robinson's Tracks of My Tears and Heatwave, these weren't museum pieces of cover art. They were a laboratory. Tight breath control, lean but precise electric guitars, and string arrangements stripped of excess sweetness. Offstage, it was a life of endless rehearsals, constant travel, and a battle for technical excellence at her concerts. Ronstadt demanded the best sound and the best musicians, because her shows relied on the microdynamics of her voice, not on stage props. By the time of Hasten Down the Wind in 1976, she seemed to be rethinking herself, shifting focus toward intimacy, less external drive, more inner tension. Carla Bonoff's Someone to Lay Down Beside Me and Lose Again, along with Warren Zevon's title track, turned into cinematic pieces under her interpretation. Dark string tones and steely pedal steel glissandos underpinned her voice with a sense of foreboding. Her version of That'll Be the Day proved again that Ronstadt could refresh the rock and roll canon without smoothing out its edges. Meanwhile, her stage band was evolving into an elite lineup. Guitarists like Waddy Wachtel and Andrew Gold, Kenny Edwards returning, and pedal steel master Dan Dugmore. Behind the curtain, Ronstadt was already thinking about how to reach her peak. She sensed the cultural shifts that were coming at the end of the 70s and consciously moved away from the image of a country girl, reinventing herself as an artist of broader scope. Here it's worth noting her entrepreneurial streak, something she inherited from her father. It wasn't as visible at the start when she was focused mainly on her sound, but once the seeds of commercial success were planted, Linda became one of the very few women in the industry to grow and shape it herself. Her peak of the 1970s came with Simple Dreams, released in 1977, the defining crossover album of the era. Only a world-class interpreter could weave Roy Orbison's Blue Bayou, Buddy Holly's It's So Easy, the Rolling Stones' Tumbling Dice, and Warren Zevon's Poor, Poor Pitiful Me into one seamless breath. In Linda's hands, they all felt like part of a single repertoire, because the album's drama was guided by her voice, not by genre. She followed it with Living in the USA in 1978, a louder, shinier record, complete with its iconic roller skates cover and a punchy set of covers. Chuck Berry's Back in the USA, Smokey Robinson's Ooh Baby Baby, and Just One Look. It was a record about speed. The rhythm sections hit harder, the guitars were tighter, and the stage grew bigger. But for many fans, the late 70s are remembered not just for the music, but for the tabloid headlines. Ronstadt's personal life was under constant spotlight, especially her high-profile romance with California Governor Jerry Brown. Surprisingly, when you look back at the industry of that time, the success, the romances, the tabloids, it all seemed to leave Ronstadt untouched. She kept creating, moving forward with no slowdown, in circumstances where many other artists would already have been in decline. By 1980, Linda made a deliberate change of direction. Mad Love marked her turn toward new wave and power pop rock. Faster tempos, punchy drums, sharp guitars, and the same interpretive precision. Hits like How Do I Make You and Hurt So Bad gave the album its pulse, while Elvis Costello's Girls Talk and Party Girl were delivered not as museum pieces, but as slices of living urban prose. Her next step was the stage, with Joseph Papp's The Pirates of Penzance. First on Broadway, then in its screen adaptation, Ronstadt returned to breathing technique, diction, and theatrical motivation. An orchestra pit demanded different articulation than a rock stage. You can hear the effect on Get Closer, 1982, a less hard-hitting record but sharper in nuance from the title track to I Knew You When. It set a new principle, not chasing trends at any cost but expanding her palette. That shift was underlined by her bold albums of standards, arranged by Nelson Riddle. What's New, 1983, Lush Life, 1984, and For Sentimental Reasons, 1986. Gone were the electric guitars, replaced by full orchestra. No radio hits, but instead the Great American Songbook. Commercially, they were a triumph. Culturally, they revived outdated lyricism for a mass audience. Linda didn't copy Ella or Sarah. She sang in her own way, long, carefully controlled lines without showy vibrato, where meaning rested on breath and the shade of a consonant. Working with Riddle became a personal school of control, shaping her timbre to fit an orchestra, learning not to force the high notes, mastering the patience of silence. After Riddle's death in 1985, she carried the cycle to its natural conclusion, honoring his style while also making it her own. But the experiments didn't stop there. If anything, Ronstadt seemed less interested in commercial calculation and more in sharing the personal, and life rewarded her for it. The clearest example was her most personal statement of the decade, Canciones de mi Padre, released in 1987. Not a pop experiment, but a fully realized, lavishly produced project with the finest mariachi musicians, honoring the repertoire her father once sang. For an American mainstream star, it was unprecedented. An album in Spanish rooted in tradition, and it sold massively with a tour that featured costumes, folkloric choreography, and family serenades brought to life. The record became a model of cultural bridge building. Linda didn't exoticize Mexican tradition. She raised it onto the same stage where she had sung Zevon and Orbison. As for her private life, Ronstadt chose to share less. Still, the press buzzed with headlines, especially rumors of a romance with George Lucas. The decade closed with a major pop comeback. Cry Like a Rainstorm, Howl Like the Wind, 1989. It was an album of big, glossy Peter Asher production and duets with Aaron Neville. Don't Know Much and All My Life restored Linda's radio dominance, showing how she fused the discipline of standards with the phrasing of modern adult contemporary, shorter lines, firmer grounding, and carefully measured climaxes. In the early 1990s, Ronstadt chose to keep exploring her Mexican roots. The album Más Canciones, released in 1991, continued her family tradition from Tucson, mariachi as a folk orchestra, and a repertoire she had known since childhood. The record entered the national Billboard chart and earned her a Grammy for Best Mexican-American Album. Just a year later, she won another Grammy for her third Spanish-language album, Frenesí, where she turned to Afro-Cuban standards and the palette of Latin jazz. It was a rare case of an American pop rock star stepping into the non-English canon without condescension, and in doing so, expanding her audience without losing the old one. After these Spanish-language adventures, Linda seemed to run out of steam and in 1993 released the quiet, understated Winterlight. It had no crossover hits, and commercially it became her first major failure in years. Yet artistically, it remains one of her strongest and most underrated works to this day. The mid-1990s passed with little impact, aside from her trio sessions with Dolly Parton and Emmylou Harris. Looking back, many see those records less as great artistic achievements and more as cultural phenomena. In truth, part of Ronstadt's slowdown was tied to motherhood. She adopted her daughter Mary Clementine in 1990 and her son Carlos in 1994. For a time, it seemed as if children and creativity could not coexist. But in 1996, Linda proved the opposite, transforming rock classics into lullabies on Dedicated to the One I Love, which won the Grammy for Best Children's Music Album. In many ways, motherhood reignited her desire to create and experiment. By the end of the decade, Ronstadt picked up the pace and sound again. Her 1998 album We Ran was tougher and leaner, built on guitar muscle with a repertoire ranging from Springsteen to John Hyatt to Dylan, male lyrics reimagined through her cool alto. In 1999, she released two major projects. The long-awaited Trio 2 with Parton and Harris, which went gold, featured an iconic take on After the Gold Rush, and won a Grammy for Best Country Collaboration. And Western Wall, the Tucson Sessions, a duet album with Harris recorded in Tucson. Songs like For a Dancer, Sisters of Mercy, 1917, and Western Wall formed a subtle but cohesive folk rock cycle about memory and maturity. This wasn't a return to roots for the sake of branding. It was the artistry of phrasing, where meaning rested not on volume but on pauses. By the 2000s, Ronstadt had fully stepped away from chasing hits. She never admitted it outright, but her albums grew less commercial and more exploratory. Not because she had lost her touch, but because she no longer wanted the burden of fame or the obligation to choose songs aimed at the charts. In A Merry Little Christmas, 2000, traditional hymns sat alongside the Mexican Sikochi Zikochi. On Hummin' to Myself, 2002, she tried on jazz phrasing. In Adieu False Heart, 2004, a collaboration with Anne Savoy, she wove chamber Celtic folk and Cajun sounds into country ballads. These projects were culturally rich and creatively vital, but they consciously gave up the commercial weight of her earlier work. In 2011, Linda shocked her fans by announcing she was retiring from performing. Her voice could no longer hold the notes, her breath was slipping away. At first, this was attributed to age, but in 2013, she officially revealed she had been diagnosed with a progressive neurodegenerative disease that had taken away her ability to sing. The admission stunned the public. A woman whose voice had defined American pop, country, and Latin music was saying goodbye to the instrument that had been her life. By 2025, there are multiple biographies and even Ronstadt's own memoir. But more importantly, her story remains a lesson for the American music scene. Never fear switching genres. Never fear singing someone else's material. Never fear losing form. From the early 70s through the 2000s, Linda Ronstadt turned almost everything she touched into gold, elevating interpretation to the highest form of authorship. And she achieved this not just through talent or a remarkable voice, but through the ability to analyze her own strengths, an entrepreneurial spirit, and an endless drive to create and experiment.